Chapter 2, Business Ethics and Social Responsibility, presented by Kelly Herzik. During this lecture, we'll discuss what are the business ethics and the social responsibilities of businesses, how are business law and business ethics related, what are values, how do values provide a starting point for thinking about business ethics, what is the WH framework for business ethics, what are the different ethical tests used to make ethical business decisions? What are business ethics and the social responsibility of business? Ethics in general is the study and practice of decisions about what is good or right. Listen to that again. Ethics is the study and practice of decisions about what is good or right. That will tell you immediately that there is no perfect answer, no one answer as to what makes a good ethical decision. What is good or right for one person or one group may be different than what is good or right for another group. You must remember that there is no one clear answer to most ethical decisions. Business ethics involves the use of ethical principles to solve business dilemmas. Business ethics refers to the standards of business conduct. It does not result in a set of correct decisions. You have to realize that sometimes there is no clear path to an optimal solution. Sometimes students find this difficult to grasp. But by studying ethics, we can come to realize that business decision-making is less about finding the one and only right thing to do than it is about finding the better or hopefully the best thing to do in any given business situation. Ethical dilemmas involve questions about how one should behave that requires one to weigh the advantages and disadvantages of various stakeholders in the decision. This often involves balancing the needs and wants of different individuals or groups. Basically, ethical decision-making is a balancing act, just like life. And no matter what decisions are made, some stakeholders in the decision will be hurt, while others will benefit. Probably one of the biggest tensions that businesses face is balancing short-term profit versus long-term gain. Ethical decision-making sometimes requires companies to ignore short-term profit, the quick buck, in favor of making an ethical decision that is an investment in long-term gains. Business ethics requires a thought process that weighs the benefits of a decision compared to its harm, consideration of the duties we owe each other as human beings and virtuous decision makers, and the care we have for those affected by our decisions, such as the public or the company's workers. A real-life example is the meatpacking plants reopening during COVID-19. Meatpacking companies reopened even though COVID-19 was still ravaging the states where these plants were located. The public needed to have a supply chain, so meatpacking companies had to balance the public's need for meat with the health and safety of its workers. These companies had to balance these competing interests, and many chose to reopen but with increased safety measures to protect workers, though they were not always successful because many became hotspots for COVID-19. There is always the lure of short-term profits at the expense of an ethical decision because the company and its investors want to make money. CEOs are often paid based on how much money the business makes. Having an ethical framework for decision-making helps balance those competing impulses. A real example of failed decision-making is the Ford Pinto automobile with its exploding gas tank from the 1970s. Business people need to look at the long road to see how one decision can affect basically the entire business. That's what happened to Ford. One of the biggest ethical failures in decision-making was the Ford Pinto. In the early 1970s, the Japanese were making inroads into the subcompact and compact car market. Ford wanted to hang on to its market share, so they designed a car called the Pinto. It was supposed to be a small, subcompact, and cheap car to compete with the likes of the Honda Civic and some of the Toyotas coming out of Japan. What Ford didn't realize when the Pinto was designed was that it had a major design defect in the gas tank. The neck was very thin and it could break, spewing gas all over the place. In addition, right in front of the gas tank, there were these bolts sticking out that if the car was rear-ended, the gas tank would slam into these bolts and it would be pierced, again spilling gas everywhere. All it would take was a few sparks and boom, the gas tank would explode. It was a rear-end collision problem. Ford did an analysis and figured it out during production after some cars had already been sold. Because it was so expensive to change the production, Ford did another analysis and determined that it was cheaper to pay claims quietly on the side of the people who were hurt or killed because of the exploding gas tank than it was to fix the gas tank. Eventually, the defect in the gas tank came to light. There were a lot of lawsuits, and during one lawsuit, it also came out that they had known about the gas tank all along, but chose to ignore it to keep profits up. Ford ended up paying a huge settlement, and they were fined criminally and civilly, and it nearly killed the Ford Motor Company. This decision to not fix the Pinto's gas tank was a perfect example of looking at the short-term gain and ignoring the long-term advantage to a more ethical decision. In the long run, it turned out that the unethical decision cost them more money because they ended up actually paying more than what it would have cost to fix the gas tank in the first place. Social responsibility for businesses is the expectation by a community that businesses will act in an ethical and fair manner towards community members. In essence, social responsibility is the role of a good citizen. Let's go back to the Ford Motor Company. The public expected that Ford, as a good citizen, once it found out that its car had a problem with the gas tank and could explode in rear-end collisions, they would fix it or stop selling it or recall those cars. That would have been the expectation of a good citizen. Businesses often get the protection of favorable laws designed to offer stability and encourage productivity in their business activities. In other words, businesses get a lot of tax breaks and advantages to help them grow their businesses. The law acts as a carrot to businesses to be better and to be good citizens. While social responsibility is not based per se in law, businesses ignore social expectations at their peril. Now we're going to talk about the stick. If businesses ignore those expectations, communities can enact reactionary laws to force businesses to comply with those community expectations. Remember, Chapter 1, we talked about the law as the carrot and the stick. This is what we're talking about, and it fits in nicely with our discussion on ethical business decisions. Ultimately, the definition of business ethics refers simply to the standards of business conduct. I wish I could tell you that there's a magic list of right business decisions that are always ethical, or that there's a list of right business conduct that's always ethical. That's just not the case. There's too many factors involved in balancing how to make an ethical decision, and sometimes you have to just listen to your gut. But I do want you to think about the fact that business ethics can improve business decisions and business value in the long run versus just looking at short-term gains. I think smart, ethical business people look at decision making not in a vacuum, but through the entire landscape. It's a long game for them, and they realize that making a good ethical decision today can pay benefits down the road. So, how do we make an ethical decision? Well, one of the first acts of any good professional who has to make a business decision is to gather the facts concerning the situation before making the decision. One of the most important things about a lawyer's interaction with their client is the intake meeting. Do you know why? Because that's where the lawyer gathers the facts of the situation from the client. Because if you don't have the facts of the situation, you can't formulate a defense of your client's position. And if your client doesn't share all of the pertinent facts, or you don't know how to bring them out, then you can make a bad decision because you're missing facts. The same thing happens in making an everyday business decision. From the big stuff to the little stuff. If you don't have the facts, stop, find them before you make a decision.
You also have to remember, too, that business ethics and the law are intertwined. Once you have all the facts and a potential plan marked out, it's very important to ask, is my proposed solution legal? Now, I want you to bear in mind that law is not the only consideration in ethical decision making. The law, in effect, sets minimum standards for business conduct. In effect, the law establishes the floor and not the ceiling. I mean, technically, there are business decisions that people make that are truly legal decisions. There's no question that their decision is a legal one and that it's not against the law. But that doesn't always make it ethical in a given community. They may see that decision as unethical, even though it's legal. For example, let's talk about the Federal Fair Debt Collection Practices Act. It is a law that establishes minimum requirements for debt collectors' conduct vis-a-vis consumers. However, a debt collector can afford consumers additional rights under that law, but not less than those set forth in the FDCPA. For example, under the FDCPA, debt collectors can't call consumers about their delinquent accounts past 9 p.m. in that time zone wherever the consumer lives. A debt collector may decide and that they, as an ethical standpoint, don't want to call past 6 p.m. so that debtors can have their evenings with their families. Another option would be that they get 30 days to respond to an initial debt collection letter. That's the minimum. A debt collector may decide that people need 60 days. And that may be a good business decision because people need more time to get the money together to pay, and then in the long term they may collect more money. Again, the law creates a floor and not a ceiling for ethical business decisions. Another example of the intertwined nature of business law and business ethics is contract law, which we are going to be studying later on this semester. But here, when we're talking about ethics, I wanted you to realize that the principles of contract law are derived in large part by our sense of business ethics, fairness, and the need for dependability in the commercial marketplace. A great example of this is the Uniform Commercial Code. It's called the UCC. It is a joint drafting project between two private entities, the Uniform Law Commission and the American Law Institute. These two entities decided that they needed to create a uniform law of contract law to help basically make it more predictable in the commercial marketplace, basically across the states. And this was one of those drafting projects where they looked at not only what was expected in most states, but what was expected across the states as people did business from one state to the next to the next. Basically, in creating the UCC, these two entities wanted to find ethical best practices of conduct and contract law. The UCC itself is not a law, but is rather a recommendation of what the law should be, with the goal of having all the states adopt it. This was first introduced in the 50s, and currently all 50 states and most U.S. territories in the District of Columbia have adopted the UCC with minor revisions. It's actually now become statutory law. It's built into the statutes of the states. But you need to note that Louisiana and Puerto Rico have not adopted Articles 2 and 2A concerning sales and leases. But every place else, the UCC, those best ethical practices in contract law, has become statutory law in the states. Remember that the ultimate goal of the UCC was to harmonize and standardize the law of sales and commercial transaction in the U.S., which they did. And they took ethical best practices and incorporated it into it. And so the law and what businesses expected in commercial transactions became one. It established a framework of expected rules for sales and commercial transaction based in part on long-held commercial expectations. The UCC has encapsulated our commercial expectations into U.S. national law. But what about companies doing international work? These commercial expectations, and thus their effects on the law, can vary in different countries, making it vital that businesses investigate and understand the law and commercial expectations when doing global business. It's easy in countries that have similar legal frameworks like the United States. It may not be exactly the same, but there are ethical decisions built into the law, just as there are in the UCC in the US. But what about companies doing business in countries where graft and bribery are endemic? The Foreign Corrupt Practices Act of 1977, as amended by International Anti-Bribery and Fair Competition Act of 1988, makes it illegal for a U.S. citizen or corporation, or a person or corporation acting within the U.S., to influence, bribe, or seek an advantage from a public official of another country. Basically, the FCPA makes it illegal for U.S. companies to pay bribes in other countries where it's kind of expected. It's part of business if you want to be able to get ahead. And it doesn't just apply to the corporation itself, it also applies to any third-party providers it may employ. So they can't just employ a local company to pay the bribes that they could normally not pay themselves.
Both the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, and the Department of Justice, DOJ, enforce the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. I want to give you a concrete example of a case under the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, and that's the Tyson Foods bribery charges. Tyson had a plant down in Mexico and they wanted to expand their meat exports. Because some of the countries where the products were going needed certain certifications on quality, they were paying bribes to two veterinarians who were helping with those certifications. This was particularly dangerous because if the meat was really not up to the quality standards, it could cause illness. Of course, Tyson's unethical conduct was discovered. There was a whistleblower in their Mexican plant who sent information on the conduct to the U.S. headquarters. When the U.S. company realized what was going on, rather than investigate and fix the problem, they made an unethical decision. They decided to continue to pay the bribes and make them look like legal payments on their books. Eventually, the SEC discovered the fraud, and Tyson was criminally charged and paid both civil and criminal penalties. In response to increased scrutiny in the last 10 years, many businesses have implemented anti-bribery, anti-corruption, which are called ABAC policies. Look at McDonald's versus Tyson. McDonald's wanted to open restaurants in Moscow. However, Russia is known for requiring bribes to receive supplies. McDonald's arranged to purchase its supplies from foreign providers rather than pay bribes. It likely cost them more, but McDonald's elected to act ethically and by buying its supplies elsewhere from legitimate sources allowed it to avoid engaging in questionable business practices. They had an anti-bribery, anti-corruption policy. Exhibit 2.2 on page 18 gives you some other examples of unethical business executives versus ethical business executives and their respective businesses. DOJ has issued guidance that provides a useful and well-organized framework for evaluating compliance programs guided by these three questions. Does the company's compliance program work in practice? Is the program being implemented effectively? And is the program well designed? In 2010, the SEC formed a task force and stepped up enforcement of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which is why businesses have seen a spike in enforcement action since. There are businesses who have criticized this law heavily. Rather than trying to come up with an anti-bribery, anti-corruption policy, they've tried to change the law. Those against the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act claims it inhibits companies' abilities to go into third world countries or other countries with developing markets and set up businesses. However, other companies agree that paying bribes is unethical conduct and, like McDonald's, have elected not to do business in countries where bribes are expected, or they do a workaround like McDonald's did. Many companies have created these anti-corruption policies, and these policies help protect them in enforcement actions by the SEC. While anti-corruption, anti-bribery policies may differ based on the type of business, it has to be more than just a paper policy. There needs to be continuous review and testing, investigation of any alleged misconduct, and analysis and remediation of any found misconduct. What are values and how do they provide a starting point for business ethics? Values are our view of what is good and desirable conduct and represent our understanding of the purpose for any particular decision. They are our core guiding principle. Values can be such things as the need for freedom or security, the pursuit of justice, or the goal of efficiency. Values can mean many different things to many different people. Take a look at Exhibit 2-5 for some examples of what values might mean to one person versus another. Many businesses have core values, and they publish them, and their business functions around those core values. Take a look at Exhibits 2-3 and 2-4 for some examples of core values. Values stem from many sources: tradition, family, religion, and culture, to name a few. How are competing values and goals balanced by the ethical business person? One way to better balance competing goals is to understand the logic and the purpose of the competing players to reach consensus. That is how alternate dispute resolution was actually born in the legal context. Being able to step into the shoes of another person and look at the problem from their perspective. That is one of the key tools that a good business person uses in evaluating ethical decisions. So, what other tools can a conscientious business person use to avoid ethical pitfalls?
One such tool is the WH approach, the who and the how approach. It can provide some ethical guidelines and values for decision making. The WH approach urges decision makers to consider who the decision affects, the purpose of the action, and how we view its morality. Basically, again, how to walk in the other person's shoes. Who does the decision really affect? Looking at those long-term goals and not just short-term goals. The who is affected by a particular decision, i.e., who are the stakeholders? Who's going to be affected or impacted by your decision? It could be your customers, other business owners, investors or shareholders. It could be your management team. It could be your employees. It could be the community at large, or it even can be future generations. It's looking at how the decision you're making is going to affect people, the who. The H in how. How are ethical decisions made? Well, there are three major ethical tests that make up the how, and I think they're important tools to use. And it's basically, again, putting yourself in the shoes of another person, or putting yourself in the position of the person being on the receiving end of the decision. The first is public disclosure. Imagine that the decision is being made on live television for everybody to see. In other words, would you basically allow anybody and everybody to watch the live decision, basically pulling back the curtain and letting them watch? Would they find that your decision is an ethical one? Another one is called universalization. Would we like our decision, if it was copied by other entities, both public and private, to become the norm? In other words, would we really want everybody to make decisions in this manner? Would we really, really want every business to have to pay a bribe to do business in other countries, or in our own country for that matter? The answer, of course, is no. The final one I think is the most important. And I think really it's a great place to end a discussion on values and ethics because it's called the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Basically, treat people and business rivals as you would like to be treated. It's that simple. I really think ethics comes down to, again, walking in the other person's shoes and thinking about the impact that your decision might have on others and not just short-term profits. I mean, I find as a lawyer, I've represented businesses now for a long time, probably longer than a lot of you have been alive. And I find that there are two basic ideas of people. I mean, this is a generalization, but there are two basic types of people and how they deal with the golden rule. There are some people who look at the golden rule and think it's for suckers, that basically you only got to look at number one to get ahead. They'll challenge any commercial provision. They'll file lawsuits for every single perceived slight. They're consumed with short-term businesses and how hard they can punch and fight. And I've represented those guys. You know what we talk about at dinner with those guys? We talk about their deal, how we can do this or do that, or what's our best position. It consumes them. They're very constantly involved in what's going on now. They're very transactional. They don't often talk about the future or how the decision might affect their business in 10 or 15 years. It's how it's going to affect it now. On the other end are the people who actually do think the golden rule means something, and they do try to employ it in their business lives. You know what I talk about with those clients at dinner? Their families, their wife, their kids. We talk about their community action projects. We talk about their goals for their company down the road, how they're trying to reach into expanding markets. We even occasionally talk about their vacations. I just find that people who follow the golden rule tend to be more relaxed. And they seem to be able to balance their life a little bit better with making decisions. I don't think it makes them weak. I think they have been clients who overall have grown their businesses effectively and been very successful. They've just followed the golden rule to get there. And so I think that's where we'll leave this discussion on business ethics. And thank you very much for your time today.